The city woke before dawn, not because of the bells or the markets or the first carriages echoing over the cobblestones. No, Paris woke because something dark was about to happen. A man was going to die, and not just die, but be torn apart, literally, for everyone to see. The place to grieve was already packed. Thousands filled the square, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath hanging in the cold morning air. Nobles leaned from windows. Merchants climbed onto barrels. Even children were hoisted on shoulders. Everyone wanted a view of the man who had done the unthinkable, laid a hand on the body of the King of France. His name was Robert Francois Damiens, though by now, people only called him the regicide. He wasn't a noble, nor a soldier, not a revolutionary or a zealot, just a servant, a face among the thousands who moved silently through the corridors of power, unseen, unheard, until one cold January afternoon when he stepped out of the shadows and changed his life and the image of royal justice forever. Francois Damiens was born in 1715 near Arras in northern France. A peasant's son, raised in the narrow space between obedience and hunger. Nothing in his early life hinted at history. He worked, followed orders, survived. He served briefly in the army, then drifted into domestic work. Like so many others of his class, he became part of the invisible machinery that kept the nobility comfortable, the silent hands that lit their fires, poured their wine, polished their silver. But it was while working as a servant in the Jesuit college that something began to change in him. The Jesuits were under pressure then, accused of corruption, of manipulating politics, of standing against royal authority. Damiens listened quietly as the men around him debated power, justice, the rights of conscience. He wasn't an intellectual, not even close. He didn't read Rousseau or Voltaire. But words, overheard in passing, stuck in him like splinters. They grew into something confused, angry, and dangerous. When he lost his job, bad conduct, they called it, he carried that anger with him into the homes of the powerful. Working for parliamentary advisors, he listened again. More whispers about corruption, religion, tyranny, and something inside him twisted. By the winter of 1756, Damiens had become a man adrift, poor, half-mad, filled with righteous fury he didn't understand. He told others that someone must speak to the king. But in 18th century France, touching the king was not conversation. It was sacrilege. January 5th, 1757. The day was cold and clear. King Louis XV was leaving his private apartments at Versailles, walking toward his carriage. Guards surrounded him, but security, even then, was ritual, not vigilance. Damiens waited in the crowd, hidden among servants and courtiers. When the king passed, he stepped forward. A flash of metal, a brief cry, and then chaos. The knife entered just below the ribs, between the fourth and fifth. It barely pierced the skin. The wound wasn't serious. The king would survive. But that didn't matter. In France, the king's body was sacred. To wound it, even to touch it with hostile intent, was to wound the nation, the divine order itself. The man who had done so would not be executed like a criminal. He would be destroyed like a blasphemer. Within minutes, Damiens was seized, beaten, and dragged away. The blade still warm in his hand, his clothes torn. Witnesses said he didn't resist. He only murmured, "I did it for God." From the very first interrogation, the monarchy knew Damiens wasn't part of a conspiracy. He had no allies, no plan, no manifesto. Yet that truth was intolerable. If he was just a mad servant, then the king's near death had no meaning, no grand plot to expose, no villains to punish. So the judges of the Parliament of Paris decided to invent one. Over the next 2 months, Damiens was tortured repeatedly. He was stretched on the rack, burned, branded, half-drowned. His interrogators demanded names. Who sent you? Who paid you? Was it the Jesuits? The parliamentarians? The English? But there was nothing. Damiens' words came out in fragments. Religion, conscience, injustice. Sometimes he said he only wanted to touch the king to make him better. A strange echo of faith and delirium. By February, even the torturers were weary. They realized there would be no conspiracy, no grand revelation. Still, the sentence had already been written. It wasn't enough to kill him. He would be made an example. The official decree of the Parliament was read aloud on March 26, 1757. Damiens was condemned to be taken and conveyed in a cart to the place to grieve. There to have his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, his right hand burned with sulfur, molten lead, boiling oil, and resin poured into his wounds, and finally, his body drawn and quartered by 4 horses. A punishment not seen in France for more than a century. The reasoning was clear: not justice, but theater. The monarchy needed to reassert divine authority, to show that even the slightest act against the crown would end in fire, blood, and screams. When the decree was announced, crowds gathered days in advance. The place to grieve became a festival ground of death. Taverns overflowed. Stalls sold food and wine. People came from miles away, eager to witness the rare spectacle of a man being torn apart. The morning of March 28th was gray and heavy. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, prepared his instruments: iron pincers, ladles for molten metal, cords, and chains. The smell of pitch and burning resin filled the air long before Damiens arrived. He was carried to the cart, too weak to walk. Weeks of torture had left him skeletal, his hands crushed, his feet ruined. But his eyes were open. He saw the crowd and whispered to the priest beside him, "Pardon, my God, pardon." As the cart reached the center of the square, the roar of the crowd swelled, then fell into a tense silence. Sanson stepped forward, wearing his white gloves. The ritual began. They started with his right hand, the one that had held the knife. It was coated in molten sulfur, then burned with a torch until the flesh blackened. Damiens screamed. The sound carried across the square, a sound people would later say they could still hear in their dreams. Then came the red-hot pincers. One by one, they tore into his legs, arms, chest. Each wound was followed by molten lead, oil, and resin poured into the raw flesh. Steam rose from his body. Eyewitnesses said that the air itself seemed to choke. Some nobles covered their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in perfume. Others turned pale, but refused to leave. This was, after all, the king's justice, brutal, holy, public. Still, even the executioners faltered. The torture lasted nearly an hour, and Damiens did not die. He moaned prayers, half words, half sobs. At last, Sanson gave the signal. 4 horses were brought forward, strong beasts from the royal stables. Ropes were tied to Damiens' wrists and ankles. The horses were whipped. They pulled. The ropes went taut. The crowd gasped, but the body held. The human body, it turned out, was stronger than the spectacle required. Sanson ordered more horses. 6 in total now, each straining, each lathered with sweat. Still the limbs held. It was a disaster. The exemplary punishment was failing. The crowd began to murmur. Finally, one of Sanson's assistants took a knife and cut through the tendons of Damiens' joints. Then, slowly, horribly, the horses succeeded. One arm tore free, then the other. The legs followed. Even then, witnesses said Damiens was alive, his lips moving, his eyes open. The priest leaned close, offering a crucifix. Damiens kissed it, whispering his final words, "Pardon, Lord." What remained of his body, the trunk, torn and bleeding, was lifted onto a pyre. Wood soaked in oil was set alight beneath him. It took nearly 4 hours for the body to burn completely. When it was over, the ashes were gathered and scattered to the wind. The crowd, once restless, now silent, began to leave. Some wept, others drank, but none forgot. Even those who had come for entertainment felt something dark settle in their stomachs, the realization that they had seen not justice, but something monstrous. Among those present was Giacomo Casanova, the Venetian adventurer. In his memoirs, he wrote that he had to cover his ears to block out the screams. He described the horror of the sound of tendons snapping, the smell of burning flesh, the chaos of the crowd. Half fascinated, half sick. Other chroniclers echoed the same sentiment. The execution had not strengthened the monarchy. It had exposed its cruelty. The act meant to sanctify the king's body instead revealed a power terrified of its own fragility. Even within Versailles, whispers began to circulate that the punishment had gone too far, that it had made the king look less divine, more human, and therefore more vulnerable. For contemporaries, the execution of Francois Damiens was not simply a punishment. It was a ritual of control. The monarchy's power rested on spectacle, on fear. But there was something shifting beneath that surface. The Enlightenment was spreading across Europe. Philosophers like Beccaria, only a few years later, would use Damiens' execution as an example of judicial barbarity. The idea that a state could claim moral authority while practicing cruelty began to crumble. What had once been called divine justice now looked like madness. When Thomas Paine published Common Sense in 1776, he referenced Damiens' death indirectly, warning that governments ruling by terror eventually devour themselves. And when Michel Foucault, centuries later, opened his book Discipline and Punish with this same execution, he did it for a reason. Because in that single event, the torture, the crowd, the ceremony, lay the essence of an old world dying. Louis XV recovered from his wound, physically at least, but his reputation never did. His court began to rot from within, corruption, scandal, distrust. 30 years later, his grandson, Louis XVI, would face his own execution under a new machine designed for equality in death, the guillotine. The monarchy had thought it could maintain power through terror. Damiens' execution proved the opposite. The horror did not silence the people. It made them think. It showed that the king's justice was not divine. It was human, flawed, and grotesque. Over time, Damiens' name faded from public memory, but not from history. His story became a mirror. Philosophers, historians, and jurists would return to it again and again, a reminder of what happens when authority loses restraint. Today, the place to grieve is gone, renamed, repaved, civilized. But beneath the stones, beneath the centuries of dust and noise, something of that mourning still lingers. The smell of burning flesh may have vanished, but the lesson has not. The lesson that power, when it fears losing control, becomes cruel, and cruelty is always the beginning of its end.